welcome to this review of my Corsair K70, specifically my 4th K70 and my 3rd review of one. I already owned 3 which I got through Tom's Hardware. I did 2 takes of a review of one for them, but those are a very different kind of review, and for obvious reasons I wasn't allowed to review those ones on this channel as well. But this 4th one is a donation from a viewer, so I can finally say what I think about it. Thanks, mate. The K70 is one of Corsair's most common and well-known keyboards, and it's not uncommon to see other keyboards that are inspired by its look. I have to say, I can't blame them. I know the board is a bit showy, but it's not too bad, and I think it's pretty good looking overall. I'll admit, I even like the backlighting on it. Some, like this one, come in monochrome, while others are full RGB, but in my opinion a really nice look for them is just plain red, which looks awesome on this black anodized aluminium plate. So in my opinion you don't need the full RGB model for a really good look. Further to that point, this is one of those keyboards that have pretty bad light bundling, so if you take mixed colors like magenta, cyan or yellow, which is the color I usually use to test this, you can clearly see the individual colors they're made up of, which is red and green in the case of yellow. Therefore, primary colors tend to look the best on this board in my opinion. In fact, I'd say the monochrome models are better because the RGB models have to be programmed with Corsair software, which is called the Corsair Utility Engine, which nothing short of sucks giant grizzly willy. Even for a keyboard programming tool, it's exceptionally awful, taking up huge amounts of memory, being user unfriendly, and bizarrely, if you close down the program, it shuts off the backlighting. No, let me repeat that. When you close down the program, it shuts off the lighting completely. It doesn't go to a default lighting mode or anything, it just outright switches it off. Unacceptable! Back in the day it was called Q2 and now it's called iQ, but from its 300 megabyte installer package, or in imperial units 8 3/17 inchy feet-pounds, to its 330 meg RAM and considerable GPU usage, this seems like such a useless waste of space. This older, non-RGB model, by contrast, can be programmed using just the keyboard itself, and it stores the settings internally, which is much nicer. In terms of looks, I also massively prefer the older models like this one to the newer ones, primarily because the newer ones use this hideous gaming font on them, which severely fucks up the styling in my opinion. The older models, by contrast, use a quite normal font, which looks a lot better. Similarly, they went for a diamond plate texture spacebar on the newer models, which looks just posy. I mean, what, are they afraid the key is so small and wet that you might slip off of it or something? Speaking of the keycaps, they are laser-ablated ABS, which gives pretty sharp-looking legends when fresh, but unfortunately the coating on them tends to wear out pretty quickly, resulting in the lettering blooming out to unrecognizable blobs. In addition, another problem with the coating on these laser-ablated style keycaps is that fingerprints tend to really stand out on them, which makes them look kinda gross after mere hours of use. Maybe that's why they made the font so big, to obscure the fingerprints. The older ones also came with different extra keycaps. These caps have a special top insert in them, which also has a high grip texture and a kind of slanted shape to cradle your fingers into the WASD cluster. The newer models use these grey keycaps, while the older models on this monochrome red backlit one look a lot better in my opinion. The build quality is a bit disappointing. At just over a kilogram, or in imperial units 735 flurp targs, it's average-ish in weight, but the floating switch design is vulnerable to knocks from the side. The board is known to develop a variety of problems, and it's quite difficult to disassemble as there are several dozen screws that require removal, of which most are on the top plate, requiring the removal of all the keycaps, and several ones that are hidden under the non-slip pads and the logo plate, which are almost impossible to remove without permanent damage to the board. This, nowadays annoyingly common anti-feature, is, again, just unacceptable! I mean, what happened to the good old 6 screws at the back method? The cable is braided and very thick, but it's so stiff that it tends to stick up in all directions, which is actually quite annoying. A funny and very strange feature is that it's got a pair of flip-out feet at the front as well as at the back, which allows you to raise the board, so to speak. Maybe it's for use with the wrist rest that comes with it. Well, this one didn't have it anymore, but from what I understand, they normally all come with them. It's not uncomfortable actually, and it's textured in some kind of rubber. I tested it out several times and it's pretty decent. Note that even for a floating switch keyboard, the chassis is exceptionally loud. Even though it comes with linear switches, it's louder than some clicky keyboards I own, so much so that my friends were complaining about the noise it put out over voice comms. And considering they've been through Model M's, Model F's, all kinds of Alps, etc., for them to actually complain about it is saying something. And that brings us to the switches. Now, in contrast to all the other ones I own, this K70 doesn't come with Cherry MX Red switches, but with Cherry MX Speed Silver, which I've had lots of requests to review. It's a bit ironic that I have so many MX Red boards, but haven't been allowed to review any of them on this channel yet. One day, guys. Anyway, MX Speed Silver is almost the same as MX Red, except they shortened the throw a bit, so the actuation distance is moved up from 2mm to 1.2mm, and the total travel from 4mm to 3.4mm. It has the same weighting at actuation as MX Red, 45 grams, but it bottoms out a little bit stiffer at 70 grams compared to 60 for MX Red and 80 for MX Black. Or, in imperial units, 13,000 Hydra logs of KeyCap. The shorter throw is definitely noticeable compared to normal MX switches, but it doesn't feel overly short or anything. And the weighting, again, feels different, but it isn't unpleasant. Overall, I'd say it's an okay linear switch. The idea behind this switch is that the higher up actuation point grants faster reaction and greater responsiveness, and the shorter travel gives a faster rebound and reset as well. I suppose there's no denying that it should, yes, theoretically be faster, but to what degree there are actual, genuine, measurable benefits to it, I don't know. I mean, sure, I guess it would be faster, but it's difficult to notice a difference in speed from what I can see. See, one problem is that because of the shorter actuation distance, it's even easier to accidentally activate, which is already pretty easy to do with the longer throw MX Red. And I'd say that this is the biggest weakness of the switches. This in turn means you have to be more careful with the switches, and this in turn reduces the effectiveness of shortening the actuation distance. I don't know if others do this as well, but personally I find myself partly pressing down on the keys when I'm gaming, so part of the distance is already taken away by myself. With the speed switches you can simply do this less, so you lose some or even all of the benefit. It might even work negatively depending on how much more careful you become, and that's not taking into account the limitations of the electronics and the USB interface in terms of input delay. So the claim of being 40% faster sounds a bit dubious to me, to be honest. In other words, on paper, yeah, it should be faster, but how much this holds up in practice is really debatable and certainly different from person to person. Even if it did, we're talking microseconds here, and especially for the people who don't like the feeling of the shorter throw, I very much doubt it would be worth it. The high sensitivity is especially annoying on the spacebar, which is so easy to actuate that you can do it just by resting the tips of your thumbs against the side of it, I've found. Particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, it was common for manufacturers to fit the spacebar with stiffer switches for more or less this exact same reason. Switches like Cherry MX Green, MX Light Grey and MX Dark Grey were developed as spacebar switches for keyboards that came with MX Blue, MX Clear and MX Black, for example. A very quick note on scratchiness, it's a bit scratchy. It's roughly on the same level of scratchiness as other Cherry MX switches. It doesn't really stand out as either especially good or especially bad in this regard. It's also got NKey Rollover, a 1000 Hz or lower, it's selectable, polling rate, a gaming lock, USB pass-through, dedicated media controls, and a really nice volume roller, which I found is very useful for when you're using headphones. I never really use media controls, but this roller is great and rolls much smoother than the Logitech one I tried on another keyboard. Overall, this board really isn't all that great in my opinion. I mean, it's okay and it looks good, but it's nothing special otherwise, and it has a few significant disadvantages. It's a mid to mid-high budget keyboard, ranging in price from roughly $90 for the monochrome backlit models up to $170 for the RGB ones, which is a dead easy pick. I mean, that's a lot of money for a Christmas tree, and as I said before, I think the monochrome ones are actually better. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.